Okay, we are live.
Oh, Mao,
Hi,
hi.
hi.
You're with us. Oh my God. Great to see you. So now we definitely can start.
Great, great.
Yeah. Okay. So thank you for joining us on this Saturday night. So, and my name is Dmitry Vilensky. I'm host of this uh, assembly and iteration of Institute of Radical Imagination School of Mutation. And I'm very pleased to have our guest, Michael Marder, together with us. Hi, Michael. Actually, we met first time, and I should really maybe share my first encounter with Michael writing. And by chance, I don't know why I didn't know his writing before, but once I worked on article which very much happened to be influenced by Michael writing from nomad to roots, where I was trying to analyze obvious trend in contemporary art from so-called nomadic to kind of sedentary, more kind of speculation on roots, locality, indigenous form of life and cosmogony. And I shared my draft with Oksana Timofeeva and asking her for some comments. And she immediately sent me back article by Michael, which we also put as a reference for preparation to this panel, Resist Like a Plant. And I immediately quoted so many times this text that will be published very soon. And it was really inspirational and then we discovered that Michael actually close friends of other members of our collective like Artemy Magun and Oksana, who was also part of our previous iteration here. Actually, we talked with her on issue of paradoxes of gift economy. So, and I'm super happy that today we have a chance to talk to Michael and welcome his very provocative ideas, which I guess really resonate with the current situation. I know that it started already many years because Michael developed this topic on vegetation and plants and different type of new subjectivation or desubjectivation. So, and I feel it's really super relevant for me as an artist and also as a new form of possible politics which might happening now. So Michael, please, we are really honored to have you with us and you are very welcome. Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much, Dmitry, for this introduction and for the invitation. It's also my pleasure to be with all of you here in this context and to talk a little bit about political ramifications of my planned thinking, which was supposed to be the topic of most interest in this context. And so, as Dmitry has mentioned, I started contemplating the political ramifications of planned thinking about 8 years ago, or a little bit more than 8 years ago, at the height of the Occupy movement, when I wrote what became this article, Resist Like a Plant, for Peace Studies Journal. While I was following the Occupy model as a kind of starting point for thinking about the vegetality of the political sphere, or the vegetal transformation of the political sphere, I already thought at the time that this trend was generalizable. It was not only limited to the Occupy context, but in fact was something that had the potential to change our imaginary of politics. Because whenever we think about the political sphere, we think about a kind of animal organism, the polity itself as an animal organism, and its subjects as organs in this body that is animalized, even protest actions as this kind of movement of packs of human animals through the streets and so on. And the more vegetal processes are left behind in the conventional imaginary of what politics is. So the way I approached Occupy was that here was, to my mind, a very clear example of an inner transformation in the political sphere, where politics could be thought on a plant-like model. And I will go in more in depth of what I mean by this vegetal politics in a moment. I will identify together with you 7 features of this vegetal politics deduced from the Occupy movement, but also applicable to larger contexts. But then the next step, and this is where my thinking of the political ramifications of plant thinking has reached more recently. I think that we cannot simply use the vegetal model as a clear point of resistance in contrast to the so-called totalitarian animal kind of structure of the state, or of whatever you want to call the hegemonic oppressive political apparatus. Rather, I think that the political sphere as a whole, in its hegemonic aspects and in the aspects of resistance to that hegemony, as a whole, the political sphere has been vegetalized without us really noticing it. And so in a kind of almost Hegelian way, this is a matter of bringing to consciousness or to self-consciousness something that has already happened and that keeps unfolding, but that we still have not registered completely, and we're still lagging behind with our imaginary and the figures and the models that we apply to the analysis of politics, whether protest movements or hegemonic politics. So first of all, what are the features of vegetal politics that I deduced from Occupy movement? Very obviously, the first one is being sessile. So in traditional protests, demonstrations are movements of masses of people through the streets, claiming the streets in this kind of locomotion, right? Movement reduced to locomotion, which is a particularly animal modality of movement. Here in Occupy movement, something else happened. Instead of moving through public spaces, the protesters occupied a certain public space. That gave a different kind of rhythm or pace to the protest movement itself. It gave it a time of life and also of decay and death as well, more recognizably vegetal than animal. So that's the first feature, being sessile. Obviously, this feature, and we can talk about this in the Q&A a little bit more in depth, this feature of sessility, of sedentariness, has been exaggerated and exacerbated and foisted upon us in the current pandemic conditions as well. So we can later on together think about the implications of this to the present moment of the pandemic. The second vegetal feature of protest politics, at least, is exposure. So the mere physical presence of a group planted in a particular spot was politicized. Its members were exposed both to the harsh environmental conditions, because tents are a very poor buffer between the protesters and bad weather. And there is also a more positive aspect of exposure there, the expressiveness of existence in its embodied outward aspect. And so exposure, as I use the term, is both vulnerability and expression, making oneself or being made available and coming into contact, which is also the way plants operate. They operate by exposing more and more of their surfaces to the outside, by growing more branches, opening up more leaves, flowers, and so on. So again, this is a more vegetal model than the animal one, which actually works by minimizing exposure, by hiding when necessary, by sort of maximizing and making more efficient the body of an animal that can move through space, as opposed to a plant that moves otherwise at a different rhythm and in a different way, by growing and decaying and metamorphosing. Right? So, and that precisely is the third feature of vegetal movements, political movements I pinpointed, which is anarchic growth and decay. So that vegetal protest movements do not have a single command and control center. It's not like there is a brain commanding the rest of the body. Rather, their parts can thrive in one place and rot elsewhere, including at the global level. So we can imagine Occupy as this global protest political plant that actually flourished in some parts while other parts were decaying. And even though it has largely disappeared from our radars, the decay itself was fertile. It offered fertile grounds for certain candidates, even in official political processes, who would not have been considered viable before Occupy movement happened. Right, and we clearly know who those candidates are. Unfortunately, they have not been successful like in the US in the case of Sanders. But I think that his candidacy would not have been successful without Occupy. The fourth feature of vegetal protest movements is modularity, modular growth, which is the mechanism of anarchic growth. And what it means is that when it is activated, the growth in question is modular. It adds architectural complexity by reiterating the already existing simple units grouped into modules elsewhere in the geopolitical space. So a plant does not follow the same teleological growth model as an animal. Its shape is not predefined. Rather, given the amount of sunlight and other beneficial environmental conditions it receives, its growth can be stimulated at some of the sites called meristems and not at others. This is modular growth, and it reaches a more complex level by reiterating, by constantly reiterating and recombining the already existing units. The fifth feature is non-oppositionality, which is probably the most surprising one, especially for protest movements, because protests are by definition oppositional. But my claim is that vegetal movements, by overcoming the basic opposition of an animal organism to its place, rise above this logic of mere oppositionality. And therefore, they rid themselves of some of the reactive luggage weighing down much political activism and inflicting passive citizen complaints about persuasive corruption, right? So here, even though we can talk about protest movements, they are not necessarily defined by what they are opposing or opposed to, but rather they are given a certain affirmative aspect by leaving behind this basic oppositionality ingrained in the animal condition, the opposition of an animal to its place. Now I'm in this place, and the moment after I can be in another room, right? That's the basic oppositionality, physical, experiential, lived oppositionality of an animal, which is not experienced insofar as we can talk about plant experience, which is not experienced by plants that are really stuck in a place and grow and decay with the place where they are. The sixth feature of vegetal politics is mutability. So that vegetal politics is not the politics of abstract principles, but of an ongoing metamorphosis. And here in the context of the School of Mutations, it's probably even more significant. We will have actually a chance a little bit later on in the talk to consider what that means in terms of concrete political action, if it's a politics of mutability and not one of abstract principles that are defended at whatever cost and without any regard to the changing circumstances. And finally, the seventh feature is a little bit more technically termed with the philosophical concept of hylomorphism. And literally, it means mattered form. So there's an intimate connection between a political form and the political matter. Morphe, the Greek for form, and yle, the Greek for matter. Right, so vegetal movement, political movements are hylomorphic, and so that just as there is no abstract principle or principles in vegetal politics, so there is no formal program of development independent of actual growth, decay, and metamorphosis that are the plant actions. These are not just processes, these are not just passive reactions to the environment, but growth, decay, and metamorphosis. Even plant scientists themselves, insofar as they talk about plant behavior, they consider these to be the ways a plant acts. and it acts precisely by molding itself, by changing its mattered form. And so there are no vacuous forms here. We have here a negation of the form as an empty container to be filled with anything whatsoever, which means at least two things. It means informality and deformalization. So on the negative side, vegetal politics is deformalizing, and on the positive side, it's more informal, as opposed to following some preset procedures and rules. Now, so these are the 7 features in general of vegetal politics, or specifically of vegetal protest movements, that I deduced from the Occupy movement. But that said, and this is the additional step that I would like to take with you today, it would be foolish to romanticize vegetal political movements by limiting them to progressive causes alone. For all the intellectual animosity widespread on the left to sovereignty and central authority, I claim that these are not our enemies today. Our enemies is not sovereignty and centralized authority. We conjure them up at best from the day before yesterday. Anarchic plant-inspired resistance to a consolidated organization of an animal-like totality is nothing but an illusion. Without knowing it, or maybe knowing it actually, we don't know, but establishment politics too is vegetal, hylomorphic, mutable, not directly oppositional, modular, anarchically growing and decaying. And I would claim that the clash, if it is one, is today taking place within the folds of vegetality, within the folds of vegetal politics, which is, with the mediation of the image of the network or the web, imperceptibly defining our idea of being as such. So the meaning of being in the 21st century, not only politically, but generally speaking, insofar as it's figured as a network or a web, is vegetal as well. So if we take the worst of today's politics, I think we can show that certain inherently vegetal features are there as well. What are some of the worst features of today's politics? If we ask an average person in the street, they would say corruption, right? Corruption is the complaint, and almost universal complaint in any context, in any part of the world. So corruption is certainly one of them. Opportunism is another one, right? Opportunism is one of these dirty names for political systems, and they are pernicious workings in every corner of the world. And sometimes opportunism becomes populism, right? So a certain version of opportunism assumes a populist dimension as well. So much so that in the vernacular and in populist discourse, these two words, opportunism and corruption, become synonymous with politics. So I think if you ask an average person, they would say, politics, yes, that's just pure corruption and politicians are opportunists, right? Now, what I propose is that the critiques of current political systems and processes point toward the underside of vegetal becoming, of growth, configured as opportunism, of decay, configured as corruption, and metamorphosis, which we could probably consider as non-identity politics, as opposed to identity politics, right? So these would be understood as the deviations from an ideal of a good politics, from whichever side you approach this kind of an ideal. And I want to give these deviations a positive twist in order to get out of the quagmire of pure negativity, cynicism, resignation, and ultimately paralysis that accompany these widespread criticisms of the status quo. So these complaints about pervasive corruption, justified as they are, often leave people at a state of paralysis. If corruption is so entrenched and ingrained, there's nothing to be done. Or if something is to be done, then what is the usual electoral solution to that? Someone is elected to a high office who does not have political experience. So simply identifying with the political sphere formally already brands this person as corrupt, and by implication, it is assumed that a non-politician, very often a business person, businessman or businesswoman, would somehow bring a fresh breath of air to politics. Obviously not a very desirable situation. And we saw that happening with the Trump presidency in the US, again, in the US context as well. He actually got a lot of mileage, as they say in English, from saying that he is not a politician. He does not belong to the swamp of Washington, right? And therefore somehow is exempt from this corruption of the political sphere. So what I propose is for the rest of my remarks to consider one by one these three undersides of Vegetal becoming in politics: opportunism, corruption, and non-identity, in order to get a more complete picture of vegetality in politics today. Now, opportunism, first of all, it has been for a long time, not only in the 21st century, a derogatory term for the absence of core principles behind personal or political conduct. Concretely, it may entail forging tactical, strategic alliances with those previously deemed enemies, breaking past promises, and acting according to the changing circumstances. And I know that a large portion of our audience today comes from Russia. Obviously, Lenin, at the time of the Russian Revolution, in the inter-revolutionary period, had a number of polemics against opportunism, the opportunism of social democrats, chief among them Karl Kautsky, who, according to him, betrayed Marxism, right? And so it is in Lenin that we find this very strong critique of opportunism, as opposed to a politics of basic principles, right? Immutable principles. Short of defining it, Lenin notes that opportunism was, and I quote from him, first a mood, then a trend, until finally it formed a group or stratum of political agents who pay lip service to their cause, the revolution. And curiously, Lenin adds a footnote attacking, quote, the international type of pseudo-Marxist who vacillates between opportunism and radicalism, but is in reality only a fig leaf for opportunism, right? So very kind of contemporary remark made more than 100 years ago by Lenin. But I think what is important is this kind of development of opportunism that Lenin gives us. First a mood, then a trend, until finally it forms a group of political agents. As a mood, opportunism is ubiquitous. It saturates the political atmosphere. As a trend, it turns into a principle of no principles behind much of political talk and action. So it's not like there is no principle, but it's the kind of overall principle of no principles, right? That's the trend of opportunism. And then finally, as a stratum, it condenses into a political subject attuned more to the prevailing moods and trends than to clear programs or ideas. So a very populist kind of finally definition of opportunism, I think, might be emerging here. But could we not say that plant growth is opportunistic? In fact, again, if we read the scientific literature in plant sciences, plant scientists use this term opportunistic growth in a positive way to define how a plant grows. Without a fixed architectural blueprint for a mature tree, a sapling will develop there where conditions are more favorable. It will grow more and longer branches on the sunny side, send its roots to the most resource-rich patches of soil, and create alliances, these opportunistic alliances with insects, fungi, birds, etc., depending on the shifting circumstances. Modular development is triggered at those meristems, those embryonic parts of the plant at which the environmental conditions are propitious for future growth. Highly attuned to fluctuations in its developmental context, a growing plant is of a piece with the dynamics of its place. So it's not like, again, there's no clear-cut division between the place where a plant grows and that very plant. There is a constant back and forth, an adjustment and adaptation of a plant to its place and a place to the plant actually as well. So to qualify vegetal growth as opportunistic, therefore, is to affirm its non-oppositionality, plasticity, mutability, and hylomorphism. Now, whereas a principled stance makes an appeal to the unchangeable core, a deep layer of tenets and convictions that cannot be violated without interfering with the identity of the one sticking by them, opportunism moves on the surface, or better at the interface of the opportunist and the political milieu, as it monitors and responds to the morphing edges of things. That is why Lenin links opportunism in the first instance to a mood, a fleeting state of mind that does not constitute the identity of the one who is in it. Opportunism is, he uses this Russian term, настроение, is a mood, not a kind of core belief or idea, but really a passing kind of cloud in the, or sunny spell in the realm of the mind. Instead of the principle of solidarity, strictly divided along class or other lines, opportunists receive their cues from the political conjuncture that presents ever-fresh collaborative possibilities. And Lenin himself, for all his critique of opportunism, obviously was quite opportunistic when he recruited the masses of Russian landless peasants for the cause of a proletarian revolution. Right? His own approach to opportunism was not principled, but precisely opportunistic. In short, a politics of transcendental principles and truths is blind to the historical context of concerted action, which is equivalent to the place and time of growth. And on the other hand, opportunism is utterly immersed in and driven by this context, which makes it existentially vibrant. Now, Lenin does not hesitate to resort to the language of botany in describing opportunism. It is, he writes, overripe. Opportunism is overripe, on переспел. Opportunist political activism is a sign of decay, of having crossed over to the bourgeois camp, seeing that the bourgeois regime is in a state of decomposition, rotting into the ground in which a socialist and later a communist order would germinate. This whole development of modes of production in Marx, which is then adopted by Lenin, is itself following a kind of organic model that is vegetal, of growth that finally turns into decay, but decay that prepares the ground for future growth, right? So the whole emergence, usually read as a kind of teleological movement in history from say, slavery to feudalism, capitalism, socialism, communism. This whole development is a kind of rotation of growths and decays at the level of economic and political conditions that, as the previous regime decays, it gives rise, gives a fertile ground to a new regime. Right, and I think that both Marx and Lenin vacillate between this kind of more vegetal model and the more animal model of a new world that is born from the old in the birth pangs, which is a much more animal model of emergence as opposed to the more, I guess, more smoothly functioning vegetal idea. And this leads us in turn to the issues of political corruption that are on people's minds, and if nominally on populist agendas, irrespective of their national belongings. So we have talked about opportunism, and now what about corruption? When the undoubtedly justifiable complaints about corruption switch into an active gear, they routinely prompt calls for widespread purges in the echelons of power. Again, this is nothing new. Usually after a revolution, there is a period of purges. If we think about the French Revolution with Robespierre or the Russian Revolution with Stalin, precisely this kind of idealist fervor of the revolution then judges the surrounding milieu as corrupt. And in order to attain this ideal of purity, purges are necessary. But before contemplating possible solutions, it would be prudent to think through the meaning of corruption, keeping at bay the repulsion it involuntarily induces. Let's think about this word that is so prevalent in today's political discourse, this word corruption. I think that the word itself is actually very theologically laden. It comes from theology. Obviously, corruption is sin, and the original sin is the first corruption of the human. But we can keep this in the background of the comments as we go through them. The moment we consider this word, we realize that the nightmare of the always worsening political corruption is the shadow cast by the neoliberal dream of infinite economic growth. So this is the split that we get once at the economic level, we are given the ideology and the dream of infinite growth without decay. The underside of that is the political infinite decay without growth, which is corruption, right? Both fantasies are obviously untenable because it is necessary, as in the plant world, to combine these two movements of growth and decay that feed on one another always. Both fantasies are untenable. Just as nothing can grow indefinitely, so it is impossible for something, say for politics, to rot without end. What we have before us are two movements of vegetality isolated from one another, ideologically driven apart and allocated to different domains of human activity, infinite growth in economics, infinite decay or corruption in politics. And they become monstrous, immeasurable, incommensurable due to their uncoupling. So the problem is really the decoupling of growth from decay, which is in any event never complete. Non-oppositionality applies to the vegetal movements of growth and decay in economics and politics. The corruption and decay of the public sphere feeds neoliberal growth, which causes a further deterioration in the not yet privatized and non-privatizable, right? So there is, after all, a kind of hidden dialectic between corruption and infinite, so-called infinite neoliberal growth, because in the end, subterraneously, they feed one another. Rather than cleanse body politic of the signs of rotting it exhibits, we must ground the growing in the decaying otherwise, as Marx and Lenin did when they inadvertently vegetalized modes of production and showed how a new world is born from the putrefying remains of the old. Because obviously whatever rots is conducive to future life, to the future of life itself. Now, the temptation to purge corruption is nonetheless exceptionally strong, notably in, as I mentioned already, in post-revolutionary periods such as Robespierre's France or Stalin's Soviet Union. The deadly idealism of these regimes has for its enemy the materiality of existence as a whole. It is not this or that kind of deviation, right? This was the Stalin's word always, deviation from the party line. It's not this or that deviation from the perfect program, but rather the materiality of existence as a whole becomes the enemy of this pure idealism of the revolution, inevitably, and an enemy inevitably viewed as imperfect under the magnifying glass of an ideal. Robespierre construes the French Revolution in messianic terms as a chance to excoriate, in his words from one of his revolutionary discourses, the last excesses of human corruption. So the French Revolution for Robespierre is a chance to excoriate the last excesses of human corruption for which there's no cure but the guillotine, right? Hegel then interprets the ensuing reign of terror as the triumph of sheer negativity announcing absolute freedom, the freedom of spirit from matter. Hence, spirit's voiding, its transformation into a void, a kind of an abyss, right? And the project turns out to be deadly, obviously, because it embraces exposure and strives to eliminate obscurity, this project of the Enlightenment that with which this kind of idealism is coupled. Turns out to be deadly because it embraces this pure transparency, exposure, and strives to eliminate obscurity, cutting existence figured in a vegetal manner from its roots. And so here, everything gets twisted into its opposite. A break with what is opaque and impenetrable is the very rupture of corruption that blocks a gradual and always partial passage from the dark to the luminous, right? So this attempt to purge all of existence in the name of the ideal focuses on the luminous, the transparent, and the ideal of transparency is still there in politics, obviously. We all want transparent politics, a politics of accountability, right? So this ideal of transparency at the expense of the opaque and the impenetrable with which material existence is identified. So we are cutting growth off from its ground, literally from the soil, which is dark and moist and not the luminous at all. The Enlightenment dreams of feeding on the light of reason alone in a sort of sublimated and deranged photosynthesis, while rejecting the nourishment that decay provides in the dense darkness of the earth. In so doing, it undercuts the double character of human existence distributed along the conscious-unconscious axis, reflecting the life of plants above and below ground, and the disparate modes of energy production corresponding to these regions. So not only at the political level, but at the psychic level, we have to imagine our life as plant-like, rooted in the unconscious, in the dark, the impenetrable, the dense, and the obscure, while also tending toward the light of conscious existence. And obviously the parallel between psychology and politics, a kind of psychopolitics, is a very old method to follow that Plato already follows in the Republic, when he aligns certain faculties of the mind with certain classes of people in Politeia, in the city, right? So I think in Plato we get the very first clear image of psychopolitics, and therefore we cannot talk about the political without also talking about the psychological, while at the same time vegetalizing our own psychology. And I think psychoanalysis does that well, even though it does not recognize its vegetal kind of component, the unconscious as a soil in which conscious ideas, representations, and so on grow and into which they decay. We know that at least over the last 50 years, enough deconstructive criticism has been leveled at the transparency of meanings, intentions, and even desires. So deconstruction has always deconstructed meanings and intentions and desires as purely transparent and especially self-transparent. At the same time, the transparency of the public sphere has remained the yardstick of a laudable, of a good politics. But philosophically speaking, such cherry picking is internally inconsistent. Psychic life cannot be subject to a set of rules that are poles apart from those regulating political existence. Transparency is crystalline, mineral, not yet or already not alive. Something is inevitably rotten in the state of Denmark, standing for any state or political institution that in the course of its history distorts its founding intent, itself incipiently distorted in as much as it shelters an impulse and its exact opposite. So if we think about phenomenology and the history of phenomenology in Husserl, specifically, we get both sides of the same coin. His notion of intentionality, of a directedness toward as the very hallmark of consciousness, which shares with this Enlightenment ideal of transparency, of pure light, of reason, and so on. But then in late Husserl, in the Husserl of the critique of European sciences, we get a kind of recognition that there is sedimentation, still again mineral and not vegetal, a sedimentation whereby the founding impulse of whatever movement or way of thinking, the founding impulse is obscured and perverted by whatever is founded upon it, right? And the goal of phenomenological reduction is to reactivate this founding impulse, still considered to be pure in its self-identity, to reactivate it at the expense of these layers of whatever is founded upon it that have betrayed it. So instead of the usual insistence on the transparency of the public sphere, we should, I think, try to reconnect its conscious manifestations to their unconscious roots, without the hope of fully exposing either them, these roots, or the ground in which they are buried. In other words, we need to carry out a vegetally inflected psychoanalysis of corruption. The work of phytopolitical psychoanalysis is as indispensable as it is daunting in its immensity. Still, before it may begin, we must ask, what exactly is corrupted in today's corruption allegations and scandals? Is it the reputation, personality, or conscience of public officials? Is it political institutions and processes that are corrupted, or both? On the psychological side of things, the popular culprit is greed. So again, if you ask a person on the street, they would say that politicians are too greedy, and that is what corrupts them, right? The psychological culprit is greed, this limitless desire for personal enrichment at the expense of state funds or public funds. On the political side, at fault are the inefficient mechanisms of control, lacking in checks and balances, and independent accountability procedures. Corruption slips private in place of public interests. So whatever the explanation, psychological or political, in corruption, it appears that private interests somehow occupy the place of the public ones. Explanations abound, but amidst them, the main problem tends to be overlooked, notably that there is no common good in late capitalism. Neoliberalism has been effective in destroying the very notion of the common good and erasing it from concrete political programs, even of the so-called progressive parties. It has been ideologically also eliminated from people's minds and from political programs alike. So what is the sense of being honest or corrupt on the playing field of a corrupt, hopelessly rigged politico-economic game? Whenever it makes a rare comeback, the common good only briefly flashes before our eyes with regard to the fragile and shared foundations or conditions of possibility for life, right? That we're on the verge of losing, such as having breathable, not dangerously polluted air, or in the situation of the pandemic, right? This is where, at least in the beginning, in the first wave, as it's now called, some sort of an idea of a common good briefly again flashed before our eyes, because we realized these shared conditions of possibility for life are fragile. We realize their fragility. But then we can again, in the Q&A period, we can talk about the mutations once again, that this consciousness of the common good, this brief flash of consciousness of the common good suffered in the course of the pandemic. Other than that, the secret of contemporary corruption is that there is nothing corruptible, nothing primed for rotting, and so no soil for the political plants that we are to grow in, right? And now, finally, the third vegetal moment of becoming that we can also apply to contemporary politics is a change of state, or mutability, right? Mutability is not just one of the qualities of plants, and I think this is important specifically in the context in which we are meeting today, speaking about School of Mutations. Mutability is not just one of the qualities of plants and of the politics they inspire. It is, above all, what plants are, perpetual metamorphosis. And we find this idea already in Goethe. When Goethe writes his Metamorphosis of Plants, he is not saying that metamorphosis is one of the qualities of plants. He is identifying plants as such with metamorphosis. According to contemporary plant scientists as well, changes of state is how plants behave, initiating chains of morphological or physiological alterations in response to events in their environment, in their milieu. What an animal accomplishes by moving its limbs that allow it, for instance, to flee from danger, a plant does by changing its growth patterns and directions at root and shoot meristems, by shedding the existing or growing new tissues, or initiating nearly instantaneous changes in their chloroplasts in order to avoid photoinhibition. So what is called plant behavior is not obviously accomplished by moving limbs, by activating muscles with neural responses, which is what animals do. Plants behave in the ways that are appropriate to them by changing themselves, by remolding themselves, changing, metamorphosing, changing their growth patterns, shedding existing or growing new tissues, and so on. The behavior of political institutions, I would argue, is more akin to that of plants than of animals. After all, the polis, the state, the empire, are territorial entities that despite tremendous differences between the geopolitical, geographical, geophysical, and existential kinds of spatiality, span a constellation of places. And so if we think about the history of a polis, a state, an empire, and so on, it is more akin to a growing and decaying plant than to an animal, I would argue. And aren't the forms of political community that I've listed themselves proofs of vegetal political metamorphosis, of behavior via changes of state from which even the state, the political state, is not immune? So to the question regarding the trigger events for this shape-shifting behavior, we know that in the case of a plant, what happens? A plant begins to behave or to metamorphose in response to environmental conditions that are changing. If it's covered, for instance, it finds itself in the shade of another plant, of another tree, then it will alter its behavior, its growth patterns in order to get out of the shape. So there's always a trigger event. But the question is, what is this trigger event at the political level? The typical Marxist response is very clear. The trigger event for this shape-shifting in politics is the unstable conditions for the appropriation and expropriation of wealth. When conditions for the appropriation and expropriation of wealth change, the form of politics itself changes, metamorphoses, transforms itself. Just as both plants and animals act to nourish themselves, to develop defenses from threatening stimuli, and to reproduce, so do political institutions. In a situation of war, which could not be more animalistic, it seems, the troops themselves may advance and retreat, but the polity they defend or attack does not go anywhere. It either grows or contracts with the conquest of territories. The empire is the quantitative growth of a state that at a certain tipping point becomes qualitatively different, no longer a state, but precisely an empire. The rule of transnational capital does more than that, as I've already mentioned. It does more than undermine state sovereignty. Up to a point, it uproots the political communities it feeds on, heralding their final metamorphosis into something non-vegetal, right? And here in this context, I think that identity politics is a case in point of betraying and actually freezing vegetal political movements. Identity politics that is also so prevalent in some corners of the left, or whatever considers itself to be the left, specifically in the North American context. Whether it affects plants, animals, or humans, an identity stiffens behavior into a mask. So we talked about plant and animal behaviors, but when we talk about an identity, it is a kind of a mask in which behavior congeals. An identity refers to what, not to how, something or someone is. The divisiveness of identity politics has to do with its exclusivity, a shrinking of its categorical boundaries until at its most determinate, it admits only a population of one, right? So at the very extreme, identity politics and its constant shattering and division into ever more exclusive units admits only a population of one. Identity precludes growth and decay. Like transparency, it is closer to the world of minerals than that of plants, which is why it is so brittle despite its stiffness, and which is why it shatters easily into tiny bits. And like abstract principles, it pre-exists its contents too. It's like this vacuous empty container that receives whatever subject matter into itself. Richly differentiated as it may seem, especially in comparison with the simple, infinitely iterable modules of vegetal growth, infinitely differentiated as it may seem, identity is formally poor. It isolates, posing barriers to solidarity. Plant politics, on the other hand, is a politics, I would say, of non-identity, thanks to the mutability and the hylomorphism ingrained in vegetal ontology. And so to conclude on this kind of slightly more hopeful note of direction to move toward of a non-identity politics, I would say that non-identity politics drastically reorients our perspectives on community, solidarity, coalition, or alliance building to the extent that it starts from the middle, from the interfaces between growths and symbiotic assemblages, meristems, transition zones around the roots, feedback loops with environmental conditions. And it does not therefore start from self-contained units that need to be somehow articulated with one another a posteriori. Right? Which is, in identity politics, there is always this problem of alliance building, because you have to be more inclusive toward this or that identity. You have to form this mosaic of shards, really hard shards. And non-identity politics avoids this kind of quagmire by starting in the middle, from at the interfaces between growths and symbiotic assemblages. Stretching toward the things it binds from the middle, non-identity politics is relational, provided that by relation we mean both the common and that which is no one's, right? So in this rethinking of commonality of the common, especially in relation to the common good, we have to also include the void, I would say almost, of that which is no one's, what belongs to two or more elements and the no man's land in between. And the very basic idea of the commons at the elemental level, obviously it has historically been the soil and the land in the context of England or Britain, for instance, right? The commons were certain areas for pastures that could be used by about anyone. But at the elemental level, I think we can think about all the classical elements, from the air to fire to water and the earth as the commons, something that is especially problematized once again in our contemporary situation of air, which can no longer be the commons that it has always been, right? So the mask, necessary as it is for personal protection, is ultimately a privatizing, a kind of privatization in its zero state of being imposed right onto the human body itself. The stretch, the span of non-identity, is the space and time of plants, the space and time that are also ours, if and when we refrain from chopping ourselves and the world up into fully independent, discrete entities and embrace this constant metamorphosis that we see in plants, the metamorphosis of ourselves and the world, of ourselves into the world and the world into ourselves. Vegetal movements in politics have this deformalizing effect, and they're also rooted, as though it were their cause, in the weakness of the human levees trying in vain to contain the torrents of life. Obviously, all of this is open to questioning again in today's pandemic situation, and I very much welcome discussion and debate of these features with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. It was really bombastic with full of ideas, and I hope we run into discussion. So please don't be shy, and you can drop question into chat, and also just raise your hands or just jump with your question. But maybe because I was preparing a little bit, and I have some general question, because first of all, I was very much inspired by your idea of that non-identity politics and commons and space in between, and especially that something which can be considered as belonging to no one. So for me, it was also that was my general and very beloved speculation that even we can claim as universality as belonging to no one, not as a Western or not as a kind of certain tendency is thinking, but actually it's everybody's and no one's. Anyway, but I would like maybe to start with very general question, because right now, you know, it's very popular in art world, in academia, to make references to certain kind of non-Western line of thinking. And actually, you criticize that zoo-centric bias of philosophy, and of course, most of your references belong to this kind of tradition, which you're trying to overcome or upgrade. But at the same time, I would like to ask, do you feel any kind of influences from that non-Western tradition, and particular cosmologies which have presumably no separation between that kind of object, subject, nature, culture, and plant, animal, human division. So if you could comment on this, would be really nice.
Yes, thank you, Dmitry. I know that it has become very trendy to look for
Yes, that's what I also would like to hear your critique about that. Yeah.
Yes, my critique would be simply that I think one's thinking has to be also, in a sense, rooted. It is rooted in a certain tradition. It is rooted in a language or languages. Obviously, one can span more than one tradition and more than one language, but it requires years of steeping one's thought and one's readings and one's contemplations in those traditions and being somehow a part of them. So I definitely don't feel I'm qualified to do so, and I think that it would be a very presumptuous idea on my part that I somehow can resort to so-called non-Western thinking to look for support mechanisms or supports for what I call plant thinking. It would be also highly unethical using them precisely as a resource. It follows the same, I think, logic of objectification and appropriation that we probably want to criticize. It is not a resource, but I welcome, again, these kind of cross-cultural or intercultural encounters can only happen in the space in between, in this intermediary ground where I cannot claim the knowledge of that other tradition, and probably someone coming from that other tradition cannot claim me and my knowledge fully. And so in this in-between, no man's, no woman's, no plant's land of an encounter, something could flourish. But even though obviously I have looked at certain what you could call non-Western sources, I'm not, definitely I'm not qualified to speak on their behalf. I also think that in what we very easily dismiss as the Western tradition, there are enough lacunae and dark spots and forgotten figures and movements to give us the tools to subvert or overcome that tradition also from within. This was obviously the quest of deconstruction from its inception. Derrida followed along these lines of looking at the margins, but the margins that are at the center, at the heart, at the core of a tradition, at a certain unconscious or repressed material that at the same time makes the self-formation of the tradition possible. And in this spirit, one of my most recent projects has been studying the works, the writings of this 12th century German mystic, Christian mystic, Hildegard von Bingen, for a very curious, heretical, one would say, reading of Judeo-Christianity by way of vegetalizing all the major figures in the canon, from the prophets to Jesus and Mary and so on and so forth. So again, she's one of those, there has been obviously a revival of interest in her thought and her work recently as well, but she has been one of those forgotten dark spots or lacunae within the so-called Western tradition that works very much against the main or predominant thrust of that very tradition. And that has been my strategy, my technique from the very first kind of conception of plant thinking as well, to move immanently within Western tradition, but to reach a point, hopefully, that is somehow at odds with its predominant thrust.
Thank you. So we still waiting for some question, but if I can ask a little bit more, because I really, as I said, I really appreciate your bold critique of that identity politics, but at the same time, I would like that you could comment on one contradiction which I found, because your reference in that vegetation of the politics through Occupy movement, but at the same time, also many people would admit that actually Occupy was vivid example of identity politic itself. So apart from that vegetation, so we also have that identity, certain manifestation, which also have very long and very vivid tradition right now in current political movement. So that's why I would like, so non-identity politic based on relation which build commons, but at the same time, would you consider possibility of commoning that identity trend, particularly in US and in Europe and also in some other places?
Yes, so definitely there you're right to point out this contradiction between the identity politics of Occupy and the end point of my talk. But at the same time, one of my main theses that I presented at the beginning was that today the political camp is thoroughly vegetalized. So it doesn't matter if we're talking about the politics of states, the politics of protest movements. There is the vegetal formation and transformation of politics is underway at every one of these levels. And what we have is not necessarily a contradiction, but a vegetal politics more or less conscious of itself. That is why when I'm saying that the so-called status quo is no longer the centralized authority, our enemy is no longer the sovereignty of the state or centralized authority, the politics of the status quo is also vegetal, perhaps unbeknownst to it. I'm not sure to what extent it is really unconsciously vegetal. Perhaps there is something of this mutability. Obviously, they probably do not attach this label to themselves, but this kind of mutability and non-oppositionality and all of these 7 characteristics of vegetal politics I outlined are also there in what we call the politics of the status quo. So I would not talk so much about contradictions as about the degrees of consciousness, as it were, of the vegetality of one's political stance. Yeah.
I see. So I was following chat, and we have 2 people who would like to speak. So first, I think Charles, please. I hope you can unmute your mic. Yeah.
Yes. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah. Would be nice if you can turn on your camera if you feel like.
I'm in temporary quarters right now, so the background's not exactly.
Okay, it doesn't matter. Okay.
So I'm Charlie. I'm a social anthropologist. I'm doing some research, and I'm based in Belgium. And I've had occasion that more and more of my work and research is kind of overlapping with what I've been coming to call, refer to in shorthand as posthumanism. And post-humanist philosophies, critical post-humanism, things like that. Now, my question is, I'm not so much saying that, or situating your work explicitly within post-humanism. I'm not sure if that's a term that you choose to use or not, but it struck a note with some of this. Now, when I tried to bring these topics up of post-humanism or multi-species ethnography, something like in the vein of Anna Singh and Mushrooms at the End of the World, I always get some rather odd looks, and if not incredulous, some disbelief. I was speaking with an urban designer, and he told me, quote, "I don't believe in post-humanism." And so my question is like, how are you kind of thinking about popularizing these narratives in your work and trying to reach out perhaps a little bit further away from the activist realm, who really kind of connect and critically connect with this theory and these ideas, and kind of reach across some of the political spectrums to people who may not have the academic background of understanding the connections between the vegetal or the animal and political resistance? Thank you.
Well, thank you for your question. Obviously, as I mentioned in the beginning of my remarks, this is a kind of offshoot or ramification of my overall project in vegetal philosophy. By no means is this the main stream through which I'm thinking what I call vegetal being. So as you've said, it depends on the audience I'm addressing. Here I'm addressing perhaps an audience of, as you're saying, activists, some academics and so on. When a certain museum or gallery invites me to present, I choose something a little bit closer to the experience of an expected audience at that milieu. But to go to your point about posthumanism and multi-species discourses and so on, I think very often my work is grouped with those trends, but I resist this kind of a grouping precisely because I think that a certain identity politics is operative at the level of so-called posthumanism and multi-species thinking, because it does, let's take multi-species, it starts with a species. It starts with these conceptual boxes prepared for particular kinds of beings, and then thinking, how do these boxes overlap? How do they interact, and so on. So it's an identity politics writ large projected onto the natural world. And the same with posthumanism. It's assumed, simply assumed, that the being called human is something that we have figured out and surpassed. It's assumed that the meaning of the human has been fixed once and for all and can be now left in the past, and we can move on to the brave new world of posthumanism. That is not my view at all, because I think that if anything, the meaning of the human is not in the past, but in the future. And perhaps in the future that is not ever attainable fully, because every single one of us, and we all as a shifting collectivity, either in this context or in other contexts in which we find ourselves with others, we have to negotiate and cultivate the meaning of that humanity, each for her, himself, and also in a certain togetherness. So the human is not, again, a category, is not a box, or is not a species, but is a task to be accomplished without ever sort of attaining a perfect outcome or resolving the problem of what is human or who is human once and for all. And that's why I would distance my own thinking from both of these streams of thought that you have mentioned in your remarks.
Thank you very much. That was very insightful. I appreciate your response.
Yeah, me too. And we have another in line. Andrea, please.
Oh, hello, everybody. Hi, Michael. Thank you so much. It was excellent. I'm zooming in from Vancouver, Canada, and my training is more in analytic philosophy. Hegelian philosophy isn't intuitive for me, maybe for others here. So that's probably, I have really two questions. You can answer either if you like. Could you just give some of us who aren't intimately familiar with Hegelian metaphysics and teleology and theories of change and ontology, a kind of a thumbnail sketch of the distinction maybe between why is this not just a metaphor? Vegetation, vegetal philosophy. What's the difference between being and becoming from a Hegelian ontological perspective and a lovely metaphor for life? So that would be kind of one of my questions about helping me and others maybe get a better sense of how Hegelian metaphysics fits in with this theory, if that's even an appropriate terminology. Also, I'd like to know that why not, like I know, oddly enough, some of my First Nations friends, they talk about, of course, that mountains and streams are also alive, that they move, they morph, they change, they resist, they erode, they decay, they bring rivers, bring forth new life. So why are we privileging plant over what we have historically thought of as mineral life, if you will. So, and I guess maybe that, I mean, this is kind of an afterthought, but one thing that we did have a little training in was deep ecology and Arne Ness. And I know that he also has some sort of, I don't know, Buddhist view of the egalitarian value of all life, but I don't think he speaks to the question of mountains and streams. So there's a couple of little thoughts for us to gnaw on. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Andrea, for these really deep and provocative questions. Now, in my initial formulations of planned thinking, I do not, obviously I rely a lot on Hegel, but I go much further back than Hegel to Aristotle. And I think that I would like to probably ground both of your questions in certain Aristotelian or ancient Greek conceptions of being rather than Hegelian. Hegel obviously follows Aristotle on many points, so whatever is there is still very much indebted to Aristotle. Why is this not a metaphor? We know that in Aristotle, in his treatise On the Soul, on Psyche, Aristotle identifies three layers or three levels of the soul. One is broadly vegetal or vegetative, to threptikon, which includes the principles of nourishment and reproduction. And this is, Aristotle says, the only level of the soul that is accessible to plants, but is also common or shared by all living beings. So whatever all living beings are, they also are that. They also have nourishment, the capacities for nourishment and reproduction at their disposal. Then, in addition to that, there is the so-called animal level of the soul, the sensory one, and finally the properly human, which would be rational thought and the capacity for cognition. And obviously this has been always read in a hierarchical kind of way, hierarchy of beings, with plants being the lowest ones, even though Aristotle clearly recognizes their ensoulment, that is their status as living and, as we would say in today's jargon, subjects. But what interested me is this, again, to go back to the question of the shared or the common common participation in the vegetal soul, starting from Aristotelian philosophy. So in whatever we do, in whatever we are also plants or plant-like, insofar as we have the threptikon, right? That's the basic insight at some point. At another level, we could ask also and look for the response with Aristotle and beyond him at what happens to other strata of the soul. Are they just added somehow haphazardly from the outside? Or, speaking about mutations and sublimations, is it this basic vegetal soul that undergoes a kind of sublimation or mutation and becomes an animal soul, sensory apparatus, and so on, which then also undergoes a further sublimation into the cognitive capacity that is identified with a human? So to my mind, it was going to somehow to the base of the edifice of what has been called the principle of life or a living being in Aristotelian philosophy, and questioning really the grounding of that whole edifice and our human participation in whatever Aristotle identifies as the vegetal soul. So again, this is not just a metaphor precisely because there are specific physiological capacities involved, nourishment and reproduction, that are then sublimated, transformed into other capacities. And if we look at something like psychoanalysis, Freudian psychoanalysis, we can really see the way in which these two capacities would be at the foundations of what Freud calls the unconscious. Obviously, Freud thinks that sexuality is the ontology of the human, right? The ontology of the human mind, of the unconscious itself. Stretching things a little bit, we could say that he draws that from the reproductive capacity of the vegetal soul. But at certain points, Aristotle himself doubted whether there was not only one capacity rather than two plants. And he thought other than in the direction other than Freud. He thought that sexuality or reproduction could be an offshoot, could be a side effect of the nourishing capacity of the plant soul. For Freud, obviously, sexuality is basic, and the nourishing capacity is based on that. And he adds even the stages of psychic development to this. So this is not a metaphor in this very specific historical context. But it is also not a metaphor in the sense in which the Greeks understood both nature and being itself, in the sense of physis. So physis, as the Greek word for nature, shares the same root with the word for plant, which is phyton, right? For the Greeks, the plant is not a category, it's not an identity. Again, it's not a vegetal, it's not a biological kingdom with its own species. Rather, it's a kind of being, it's a tendency in being, and the tendency is the tendency to grow. So plants for the Greeks are growing beings. And insofar as we are also growing, we are plant-like in a sense, right? Again, to bring that back to us. But physis, the conjunction of what we call nature as a whole, is this overall growth of all that is. So that for the Greeks, nature was not just a conglomeration of disparate things, somehow interacting with one another in ecosystems or biosphere, but rather it was it was a kind of gigantic plant with its own growth. So what I really like about this is that the universal of nature is thought on the basis of the singular. Plants are a thing in nature that provide a kind of synecdoche, provide a prototype for nature as a whole. And that goes, I think, to your second question of the First Nations considering mountains and streams as living beings with their own capacities for movement, growth, decay, and so on. This very clearly, to my mind, is also the case in the Aristotelian notion of nature, of physis, which still as its basis has vegetality. So these movements are vegetal at their core. These movements of growth, decay, metamorphosis are vegetal at their core, and the plant imparts, as it were, to nature these movements from its singular mode of being.
Right now we have a question from Mao. Please, it's your turn.
Yeah, hi.
And then Andrea, I got you. Yeah, I got your hand. Yeah.
Yeah, I really enjoyed your talk. Very inspiring. I'm also an anthropologist. My question is, what is the kind of perception within vegetal politics about entities without root, or the idea of root, being rooted without root, or the lack of rootedness? And I'm thinking about Edouard Glissant, argument that basically the notion of rootedness is very much the core of Western understanding of politics, but also, kind of the opposition between the idea of a static center associated with the empire and, on the other hand, anarchism and nomadism. So I wonder if there is space in vegetal politics for entities that are not rooted.
Yes, definitely. Thank you for this question. Of course, the notion of roots was for a long time resisted for its parochial kind of undertones. The clear example is Heidegger, who really sort of glorified the German roots in the national territory, right? And he says that without this kind of rootedness in the soil, in the soil of Germany, the spirit cannot sort of flourish into the genius that it produces in the figure of these exceptional individuals, the representatives of German spirit, right? So rootedness has this very troubled history of being associated with a certain parochial kind of identity. And at the same time, nomadism has been celebrated for its freedom from such a partial attachment, for its presumed universalism in that sense. But I think that we also, to sort of complicate things a little bit, we know that nomadism is not only, as you mentioned yourself, is not only a kind of anarchic mode of resistance, but the mode in which the empire operates. Transnational capital is very much nomadic, and various contemporary discourses celebrating nomadism somehow unconsciously, they know this. Even I'm obviously thinking of Rosi Braidotti in this context, where in nomadic subjects, she's lumping together, when she tries to explain who or what nomadic subjects are, she's lumping together transnational corporate lawyers who fly to a different continent every week and migrant workers without any sort of place to go, right? Clearly, both are offshoots of the same capitalist, late capitalist model. So it works very much nomadically. But yes, this return to roots, in my view, is not a return to a kind of parochial way of life or mode of thinking. And in the case of I have a very small essay that then developed into another more academic text. I think it was in 2017 or 18 that I wrote for the New York Times on the fight for the right to read Heidegger, precisely when Heidegger's Black Notebooks came out and he was accused once again of his anti-Semitism and so on. I do think that Heidegger missed the point in sort of identifying the Jews with this kind of uprooted or unrooted movement of transnational capital. Precisely because the Jewish people, before the creation of Israel, the Jewish people did not have a national homeland in terms of a territory, but there was a clear rootedness in the tradition. So it's a much more temporal rootedness as opposed to a spatial rootedness. I don't think that there can be such a thing as a rootlessness or an absence of roots, in other words, to go to your question. The roots themselves can be temporalized, they can be historicized, they can be, it can be a rootedness in a language or in a culture or in a tradition that is not necessarily territorial. And in fact, human roots, obviously, we might be plant-like in certain psychic processes and even in some of the physiological features, as I explore in some of my other works, but we don't have physical actual roots binding us to a place. So we, the human condition is such that we reimagine and recreate our roots, whether in terms of national belonging or in terms of tradition or culture and other terms. So just to give a very brief answer, I don't think that there is such a thing as rootlessness. There can be roots that are more spatialized or less spatialized, and never obviously completely literal, as in the case of plants.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Andrea, you'd like to continue? Yeah, please. Yeah, you can. Right now, I guess.
Yeah. Sorry, I see Joan is also asking a question. It was more just a follow-up, and again, just from a kind of naive philosophical view. Okay, thank you so much for your answer, for situating your vegetal philosophy in Aristotle, sort of prior to Hegel. So I still have a question then about Aristotelian teleology. You know, again, my background is, finally we progress beyond the Aristotelian teleology of nature. And so did this idea that the blueprint is in the thing, that it's, unlike Plato with the forms, we can look closely in the thing, and there's some sort of a unfolding of a predetermined a priori, plan. So how do we deal with this issue of teleology? That's my follow-up.
Right. Yes. So probably I could take up your question at various levels. At the level of the plant itself and its of plant development, there is a very physical embodied questioning of teleology in the plant itself, right? And this is what I meant when I talked about the anarchic character of plant life. If we look at even the genetic blueprint of a plant, we can obviously do a sequence of the DNA of a particular species of a plant, but we can never know for sure how a mature plant would look like, a mature tree would look like, based on a seed or a kernel or an acorn that we study, precisely because plants are much more open in their developmental plan and much more interactive with their milieu in shaping and being shaped by it. So at the level of the plants themselves, there is a kind of implicit physiological almost questioning of teleology in that sense. In the sense, if you are thinking about teleology as a kind of overall organizing framework for philosophy and for thinking about the world, again, if we transfer this model of vegetal development onto the world as at large, it should not be teleological, so that there is a kind of open-endedness to this. And to be frank, Aristotle was a little bit horrified, like many, like Hegel himself also. They were horrified by this feature of plant growth, which seemed to be open-ended, which seemed to have no internal inherent limit, as an animal of an average size would always have an average size to it. But the plant growth is this open-ended proliferation. Hegel equates it to bad infinity, this infinity that just adds more and more and more. And so there is a kind of philosophical horror, both in Hegel and in Aristotle, with regard to plants, but something that I find very helpful in my work. And kind of, if we think about ontology itself on the basis of vegetality, that takes us out of the quagmire of teleology that you're referring to.
Okay, thank you. Do we have more? Looks like we don't have any.
I think in the chat, Dmitry, there's at least one question from Ted.
I'll just like,
yes.
Let me see. Metaphor isn't just abstract. No, maybe Ted can speak. Yeah, no, Ted, are you with us? Before?
Yes.
Ted, maybe you can speak, or you just prefer, or you can, because I can't quickly find it.
Yes, maybe if Ted wants to voice it, that's fine, or I can read the question.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh. So Ted is saying, first, I'm wondering about lichen, thinking, for instance, of Scott Gilbert, which is plant, fungi, plant, and algae at once. But I guess the question or comment I have is that I'm feeling there is a little bit of terrestrial bias in plant studies at large. Do you agree with this? There is so little focus on other spaces, underwater plants such as kelp, and more hybrid forms of space such as swamps and so on. Okay, so yes, again, these intermediary categories, right? Lichen, for instance, and things that are indeterminate. Is it a plant? Is it an animal? Are plants that are carnivorous more like animals than like plants? Because carnivorous plants, obviously, they don't have photosynthesis at their disposal, so they actually eat insects and procure their energy that way, at least a part of it. Again, I approach these questions not from the standpoint of what is now called multi-species thinking, but from the position of the middle, which I find always to be the vegetal position, from the position of a symbiotic, of life as inherently symbiotic. And we know that plants themselves are very symbiotic beings insofar as they have these assemblages, for instance, at the root level. They have assemblages of fungi and microbes and so on. These are called transitional zones around the roots, where dividing lines between different kinds of species or biological kingdoms are very blurred. And all of this functioning together and collaborating is what allows for a plant to thrive and for the underground networks of fungi and bacteria to thrive as well. And other decomposers. Again, I don't approach this from the standpoint of species or categories or biological kingdoms. About the terrestrial bias in plant studies, here I actually follow very much Hegel in the philosophy of nature. I don't think that plants are necessarily terrestrial beings. What is really fascinating about them is that they span the different elements. They live in at least two worlds at once, underground and above ground. So they stretch up and down simultaneously, as a seed always does. A little bit below ground level, it would stretch both up and down, knowing where to put roots based on a very specific physiological mechanism that allows it to map its own space. There's a little bit of sound interference from somewhere.
It's from.
Okay, yes, thank you. At least in my view, there is no terrestrial bias insofar as the elements are bridged and brought together by plants. And if we think of the classical four elements, fire, earth, water, and air, then obviously these elements are co-constitutive of plants. They allow plants to come into being and to grow, and they are also created in part by plants. This fertile soil is created by the plants that decay into it. The atmosphere itself, a breathable layer, is created thanks to the oxygen exhaled by plants in the process of photosynthesis. So there's a kind of elemental shaping and being shaped of plants and the elements that decenters them from the earth, if that's what you call the terrestrial bias, that decenters them from the earth and makes them these bridges between at least the earth and the sky. And Hegel already recognizes this in his philosophy of nature. And I would go a step further. Not only are plants the first concrete mediations or living bridges between the earth and the sky, they are the very beings that allow the earth and the sky to be what they are, to be, because if we just think of mountains, for instance, that obviously are the protrusions of the earth toward the sky, there is not a kind of mediation or co-belonging of these elements in the way in which the mountain relates to the sky or to the air. With plants and this constant co-constitutive nature of their relation to the elements, the earth and the sky first become what they are thanks to the mediation of plants, right? This is where I would go a step further than Hegel, in a sense.
Thank you. And John, please, darling, yes.
Hello.
Hello.
Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
You can hear me. Oh, hello, hello. Hello from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. The thick of the US-American Civil War that is all around us. Everyone has machine guns and the city is surrounded by Trumpists. Each of them has 10 machine guns. So thank you for letting me feel my vegetal soul. I needed that very badly today, Michael. We never met, I don't think in person, but remember I read your translation of Bibichin. So I was just, I don't know, that's my question basically. So I was talking to Tsaplia the entire time in the chat direct messages. I won't read what I wrote, but it's a very beautiful series of associations. Oh, but I do have to show a couple of pictures installations I created while this was happening. Hold on. So this is Groot. Groot is my favorite superhero. I am Groot. I don't know if you know Groot. Then this is the most important one. Oh, there's Bagheera.
John, we lost you.
Оно, потому что Багира евнух, как я. Я трансевнух. А вот это самое главное. Вот видишь, брюки. Молодая. Красивая. Вот растение, она растение, да? А вот вот видели, да? Видели? А вот это я написал. Вот, today the political camp is fundamentally vegetalized. Да? И там Амазон. Это фотография, я распечатал все эти отличные фотографии.
John.
Органический интеллектуал.
Yeah.
и
Joan,
органический интеллектуал.
she's really organic intellectual.
Вот. А смотрите, это мой дед. Он работал в котельной в Филадельфии. Это моя мама. Это любовник, маоист из Парижа в 1969 году. Франсис. А это Фрэнк Брукс. А вот тут Асминкин, блядь, Даша и я.
John.
Это все, это мой вопрос.
Thank you, darling. Thank you. Yes.
И теперь можно называть меня в женском роде, если хотите. Если хотите. Не обязательно. Я начинаю так говорить немножко. Okay? Мы все растения.
We are all plants. Talk
We are all
English.
plants. Plant politics. Okay. Это мой вопрос. Я mute.
You mute. Yeah, it was amazing intervention, but John Brooks, very good friend and poet and artist, and yeah, he walks close with us and with you, Michael. Probably you remember. Yeah, now he's really in new transformation. Yeah, now looks more plant-like. I would like maybe close to the end to ask more quite abstract question, because I was fascinated once I read in your text, you talk about plant-human republic, how it might look like.
Yes. So yes. So thinking about this idea of vegetal democracy, right, and this branching out of a human polity, I think something like a plant-human republic can only work once we somehow get in touch with and recognize this vegetal heritage within ourselves. It can only happen once an identity politics also projected onto other species and our own species crumbles. And once again, for me, this is not necessarily a very future-oriented endeavor in the sense in which it's an ideal in the future to work toward, but rather my thinking is always what I call a work of vegetal anamnesis, an unforgetting of a certain vegetal ground of our own being, whether psychic being or physiological being, and also being with others as one of the most important facets of that. And so what would be the outlines of that more vegetal way of being with others? I have started outlining a little bit the basis for this today, but it would entail obviously much less rigid boundaries between the very dimensions of the inside and the outside. What is within an identity and outside of it? What is a single or singular human individuality and what is the collectivity of human beings? What is the collectivity of humans compare or in relation to other kinds of beings, right? And so the very, once the questioning of the singular or the individual and the collective distinction that is so rigidified in the current historical state, once that distinction crumbles or is weakened, progressively weakened at least, then something like a human vegetal republic can begin to flourish, right? Yeah.
Actually, one question comes, I don't know how it comes on Facebook chat, but it's from one also a member of our collective, Nikolai Lenikov. It's pretty long, but I can kind of summarize it because Nikolai speculate on colonies of the plants, when plants come together, and that vegetal collectivity. Have you ever problematize it? Because also what came into my mind, it's kind of, you know, that certain images of decay when humans somehow left the planet and vegetal growth unlimited, like a nightmare of Hegel, and comes over the ruins of the planet, like in many kind of films. And that's kind of mutual collaboration between plants and their possibility to defend their interest, because it resists like a plant. Because sometimes you, I absolutely agree when you problematize that together, that demons of sovereignty is right now not in that kind of animality state. It's also transformed into something else. But at the same time, you know, in Russia with the Putin, we have quite old animal demons, you know, who attack us. And as a plant, you feel super vulnerable. You don't know, maybe Belarusian protests trying to demonstrate different models where occupy something is almost impossible, not almost, yeah, you know, but at the same time inventing certain lines of escape, and at the same time attack this kind of rigid monster of sovereignty. So I'm sorry, I'm just a little bit, but you know that about that collectivity of the plants as a resistance force, not as a plant alone.
Yes, and
that was the question.
Yes, certainly. There are a number of dimensions to this question and to the comments that you brought to it also. So the first one, yes, this is what the direction which I was moving in my response to the previous question, that in the case of plants, the lines of distinction between the individual and the collective are quite blurry. And botanists or plant scientists have recognized it from very early on, at least as far back as the 19th century, that any single plant is already a collective being. It's already a kind of an assemblage of semi-autonomous, semi-independent growths, because we know that if we take a cutting from a tree, for instance, and give it the right conditions, it will grow by itself and be transformed into another plant. So the idea is that a plant is, a single plant is already an alliance of many plants, of many growths that are proceeding together. And as we know, obviously, in many of the forested areas, trees that appear to be singular individualized beings share underground root structures and networks. And very recently, yesterday or the day before yesterday, this came to the attention finally of the New York Times. They have a beautiful special of actually based on the narrative of a plant scientist from British Columbia, Andrea. Yes, she's the main character in this feature story in the New York Times, talking about this underground solidarity and kind of shared collective structure of roots in old growth forests. So these division lines between individuality and collectivity are already very blurry in the case of plants. And they are maybe even also blurry in our case, in the case of humans, but we need to recognize that and to acknowledge that. And to my mind, a very concrete way of doing so is kind of rediscovering this vegetal heritage in our own existence. And just another point to what you said before, the idea, this kind of imagination, a utopian imagination of the earth without us, right? That plants take over and everything is kind of restored to this original paradisiac state. I'm afraid this is not entirely possible, precisely because the meaning of without us, without humans, is no longer very clear. Because even though the human species might be absent and probably will be absent sooner or later, and probably sooner rather than later, given how things are going, many of the products of its life activity, of the life activity of the species, are undecomposable. In other words, and this is my take on it that I develop in this recent book, which is actually just coming out in December, Dump Philosophy, a Phenomenology of Devastation. Many of the dreams of traditional metaphysics for an immutable being, for a being that does not degenerate, that is eternal, these dreams have been achieved by the means of contemporary industrial production. Not in the case so much of human life as of the products. Plastic is a very clear example. Obviously, it's not eternal, but it takes 500 years to actually decompose, as opposed to break into smaller and smaller pieces. Or nuclear waste, spent nuclear materials that have half-lives of hundreds of thousands of years in some cases. So the world without humans is, I'm afraid, not a possibility, because the non-physical non-presence of members of Homo sapiens sapiens would still leave lots of these traces in place that will keep molding and shaping and changing this world. And very often, in the case of Chernobyl, for instance, this is the idyllic image that we get. Humans have been driven out of the exclusion zone, and therefore animals returned and plant life is flourishing. So it's this kind of redemption of the original sin of this environmental destruction. But what is often not said is that extreme radiation has interfered with the very fragile communities of decomposers that live in the soil, of all of these bacteria and insects that decompose mostly vegetal matter. And so tree trunks and dry tree trunks and leaves have been accumulating for now almost 35 years on the ground of Chernobyl, which is obviously non-sustainable because of that. They are preserved, again, just as these materials that refuse to decay and to pass away in order to open the space for the future. This vegetal matter is preserved because the communities of decomposers have been hurt by radiation. And therefore, forest fires in the Chernobyl area are becoming more and more extreme. We haven't heard about them this year because the first wave of the pandemic was raging at the same time precisely as the Chernobyl forest fires that were actually getting very close to the sarcophagus enclosing the damaged reactor. And it's likely that these forest fires would become more and more severe precisely because there's so much dry vegetal matter there. So this return of animal and vegetal life is ultimately unsustainable. And there's human interference even in the absence of the actual human beings there. Yeah.
Thank you for your answer. I guess there are some comments which, I don't know, we're supposed to read together or doing it personally. But Andrea, do you have any question? Because your hand's still raised, or is it okay? Okay, I got it, no worries. Usually we try not to exploit our guests too much and limit it strictly to 2 hours. So we almost right now, I see, coming to the end. And I have a very stupid personal question. Have you managed to become a plant, Mike? Tell us.
It is not a question of becoming a plant again as a future oriented activity. It is a question of somehow getting in touch with that vegetal heritage in us. And I think that the ongoing development of my vegetal philosophies probably testifies to the continued movement in that direction. Because to be honest, when I wrote my first book on plants, Plant Thinking, published in 2013, I thought that I said as much as I wanted to say about plants there. And that was the end of the story. But it took me by surprise, just the absolute flourishing out and branching out of this project beyond its expected limit. And I think that if anything, to my mind, this testifies to the fact that I'm still moving in this direction of getting in touch with a certain vegetal heritage at the level of thinking, at the level of being as well in general. Yeah.
Okay, we are plants, oxygen, photosynthesis. Very good. Thank you so much. Thanks everyone for joining this assembly, and thank you, Michael, for your contribution. And I hope we continue, and I wish you to continue to become a plant in a more direct